It's Emily OFC Podfix. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 10. Kakashi was up early. He was always up early, especially these past 2 months. Between sorting through the captain's office, organizing the training schedule, and keeping up with required reports to Tsunade and the department, there was too much to be done for him to be sleeping in. This morning, though, he wasn't working on any of those tasks. This morning, he was awake early just for the pleasure of it, or maybe just due to the power of routine. Regardless, he was enjoying watching the sun rise through the window while he sat at Station 10's kitchen island and drank his coffee. When he had first come to the station, he'd been skeptical about the fact that their kitchen and recreational space were together in a single room. Station 15 had more separation, and Kakashi always enjoyed having a quiet space to eat. He had to admit, though, that the layout had its benefits. At Station 15, there was some natural grouping of crew members based on their normal rising times, absent any call-outs. Whomever you interacted with in the kitchen during breakfast time, you tended to grow closer with. No such phenomenon occurred at Station 10 because once someone finished breakfast, they tended to stay in the same room, and so the morning felt more communal, more like team bonding. There was something to be said for that. Kakashi would be the first to greet everyone today. Tsunade would be visiting the station that day for the first time since she had introduced Kakashi in mid-January. They were nearly halfway through March now, and Kakashi felt sure that her visit likely meant that they were narrowing in on a candidate to replace Jiraiya. She would be there to assess progress. Kakashi knew better than to scramble at the last minute to ensure the crew and station would show well. They were where they were, and where they were was good, even if it had taken a car exploding and a month of social engineering to get there. There were many improvements still needed, but the crew was working as a team and with the right drive for excellence that Tsunade would expect. In fact, things had actually become somewhat enjoyable since the crew had finally warmed up to him. For the most part, anyway. There was the issue of Tenzō. Kakashi couldn't quite seem to calculate him. The numbers just never added up like they ought to. The man was hot and cold. Some days, Tenzō was interested in talking to him, and those were the days Kakashi enjoyed. It had been years since he'd talked to someone as easy to get along with as Tenzō was. Enough years that, while he knew when last it had happened, he wouldn't acknowledge it if he didn't have to. In fact, if it weren't for the other days, Kakashi would have said that they probably got along a little too well for lieutenant and subordinate. And on the good days, a thought or two that should have been left to wither may have been watered a bit, blossoming into short but vivid vignettes showcasing an imagined future that still stuck around in the recesses of his mind. A lively dinner at a downtown restaurant, knees bumping under the tabletop. Brisk spring walks through the park, fingers intertwined and Sparky pulling on her leash. Off weeks whiled away in a warm bed with nowhere else to be. He would be going back to Station 15 eventually, anyway, which would eliminate any professional barriers. But, despite the fact that Kakashi thought he was fairly adept in identifying when someone had interest in him, Tenzō was too difficult for him to read. As many days as there were to make Kakashi sure of it, there were just the same amount that made him confident it was his imagination. Bouts of attention from Tenzō were inevitably followed by long stretches of indifference bordering on annoyance. Kakashi could never tell when the switch was going to flip. Some days his attempts at striking up conversations would be greeted with enthusiasm, and other days they were met with a polite nod at most. Those days had Kakashi second-guessing himself. He thought about the conversation he and Tenzō had had almost 2 weeks ago, walking through the city inspecting fire hydrants. Kakashi had been sincere when he had said that Tenzō would excel as a lieutenant, and his words had seemed to light something up in the other man's eyes. Was it maybe not Kakashi that Tenzō was showing interest in, but instead the career opportunities Kakashi represented? Color in his cheeks, eagerness in his body language, nervous laughter. Was Kakashi attributing all of these signs from Tenzō to the wrong cause? Perhaps he wasn't good at telling when someone was interested, but was in fact just a narcissist. As if he knew he was being thought about, Tenzō appeared through the doorway into the kitchen. He looked surprised to see Kakashi there, which was fair. If he was the earliest riser on the crew, then he was probably used to having the kitchen to himself in the mornings. Kakashi smiled brightly at him, wondering which Tenzō he would get today. "Good morning," he said. It didn't hurt to be as friendly as possible, in case that might sway the odds in his favor. "Oh, hey," Tenzō replied, eyes shifting to survey the rec room half of the space briefly, as if to confirm there was no one else in the room. It appeared Kakashi was getting evasive Tenzō today. "Coffee?" Kakashi asked, gesturing to the pot in the machine on the counter. He'd brewed enough for several cups. Maybe a dose of caffeine would turn Tenzō's attitude on him around. Looking somewhat resigned to the fact that there was no other reasonable option but for him to stay, Tenzō smiled politely and made his way to the island coffee maker. "Sure, thanks," he said quickly. Kakashi watched as Tenzō poured himself a mugful of the breakfast blend. His hair was still wet from his morning shower, and it hung a little lower over his forehead, falling into his eyes. He brushed it out of the way several times in annoyance throughout the process of adding milk and sugar to his coffee. It was endearing. Kakashi said to Tenzō's back. "For some reason I thought you'd take your coffee black." "Gross! No way!" Tenzō responded immediately, turning his head sharply to look at Kakashi. That had been the reaction Kakashi had been hoping for. If he could just get the conversation up and running, sometimes it would take off, even on these cold days. "I don't know about gross," Kakashi said, tilting his mug in Tenzō's direction as the man turned around to face him, showing the dark, unmodified contents. "If you ask me, you're ruining the flavor by adding all that stuff." Tenzō took a closed-eyed sip from his mug before setting it down on the island. They were now across from one another, Kakashi's phone on the counter between them, open to the news article he'd been reading, but screen surely about to go dark from disuse. Tenzō looked into Kakashi's cup and wrinkled his nose in distaste. He pushed his own mug forward until it was in front of Kakashi. "Try it," he said, though he looked immediately nervous at having done so. Kakashi looked into the mug. The color was so pale it may as well have been filled with chocolate milk. He glanced back up at Tenzō, maintaining eye contact as he lifted the beverage to his lips and took a sip. He did his best to keep his face devoid of any emotion as he set the mug back down, sliding it back in front of Tenzō. "Well?" Tenzō asked, eyebrows raised. "Disgusting," Kakashi replied definitively with a smile. "I don't like sweets." Tenzō's expression contorted from one of offense to exasperation in a flash. "Well, then of course you don't like it. Why would you even try it?" he asked. Kakashi shrugged. "You made it look too good." It was a lie. He had known he would hate it. But Tenzō was back to talking to him, so it had been worth it. Tenzō shook his head, but was smiling all the same. He stepped back, leaning against the counter as he continued to sip his coffee. "How's Asuma?" he asked, changing the subject, but thankfully still engaging with Kakashi. Kakashi tapped his fingernails on his own porcelain mug. "Sick as a dog," he said. "I sent him home last night." It was nearly the end of flu season, and the crew had stayed healthy for all of it, with the exception of Hayate, who was somehow always ill, though it didn't seem to be contagious, until Asuma had showed up for that week's shift looking red in the eyes and nose. He'd insisted he was fine, but after one day into the shift, he looked like he'd been run ragged, and Kakashi had sent him home after the 100th sneeze the night before. Kakashi had gotten less sleep than he'd wanted to before Tsunade's visit, because he'd then proceeded to aggressively wipe down every surface Asaba had touched with disinfectant wipes. He hated being sick, and he'd do anything to avoid catching whatever it was the engineer had. "Damn," Tenzō responded. "So we're short today?" "Yep," Kakashi nodded. "Hopefully we don't have too many." The alert tones were right on cue. Engine 3. Structure fire. 801 West 18th Street. This one had been Kakashi's fault. He should have known better than to tempt fate. That was Firefighter 101. "Well," he said loudly over the second playing of the announcement, "I guess I'm driving. You want to ride shotgun?" Kakashi had known from the address that this job would be in his old stomping grounds, but he had expected it to be a residential fire. Luckily, Tenzō had been staring steadfastly ahead, no doubt already assessing the fire, because Kakashi probably hadn't done a very good job of hiding his reaction. The address they had been called out to wasn't a home in the neighborhood. It was a playground. And it wasn't one of those new playgrounds, all metal surfaces and soft padded wet pour rubber base. This was an old-school playground, wooden structure and wood chip surfacing. In short, very, very flammable. Even with the flames obscuring most of his view, Kakashi could see the playground's layout clearly. Although, the way he remembered it, it hadn't been a playground. It had been a firefighter obstacle course. A lone action figure or stuffed animal had been a civilian trapped on the highest platform, and he and Obito had raced at top speed to see who would be the one to successfully rescue them. The flames they had encountered back then had been imagined, but now they were very real. By the time they were ready to go, Kakashi's grip on the hose nozzle firm and Hayate braced behind him, the flames had grown tall, threatening to catch on nearby trees, crackling loudly and producing a wall of heat palpable even 15 yards back. As the water started up, they aimed it at the most concerning of the flames and quickly reduced them in stature so that they were no longer licking at the barren winter branches surrounding the play structure. After that risk was mediated sufficiently, they focused on the base of the fire, sweeping across it and steadily extinguishing it, though not without the dramatic banging and clattering of various structural elements collapsing under the force of the spray. The playground was unrecognizable to Kakashi by the time the last of the flames were out, a smoldering heap of charred black wood and melted plastic. Kakashi and Hayate set the hose down. They would need to kick and sift through the rubble to ensure that there were no remaining sparks or embers before reeling the hose back in. He saw his crew moving in, but he took a moment to survey his surroundings before joining them. The neighborhood was out in full force, which was to be expected. Fortunately, law enforcement seemed to have sent enough personnel to keep them under control. Kakashi scanned the police officers on the scene, eyes traveling down the sidewalk until he finally saw him, the same long trench coat and beanie he'd had on New Year's Eve, making him immediately recognizable. The scars on his face were shiny in the morning sun as he made eye contact with Kakashi. Detective Ibiki Morino. Kakashi had thought he might already be here, despite the fact that the fire had only just been put out. Playgrounds weren't like houses or commercial buildings. There was no kitchen, no gas line, nothing to explain a fire other than arson. And the fact that there had been 4 cases already raised suspicions that much higher. A hand on Kakashi's shoulder caused him to break eye contact with the detective. He turned around to find Tenzō, helmet under his arm, sweat causing his hair to stick to his forehead. "You coming?" he asked. It was a polite way of saying that Kakashi wasn't helping and that they were already short-handed. Kakashi shook his head. "I have to talk to L.E. first," he said, tilting his head in the direction of the detective. "Why don't you come with me?" Tenzō looked surprised. He looked back over his shoulder at Hayate, Anko, Izumo, and Kotetsu, who were sifting through the remains of the tan bark. He turned back to look at Kakashi. "Me?" he asked. "Yeah," Kakashi confirmed, taking off his own helmet and running a hand through his hair, lest it look like Tenzō's. "You want to be a lieutenant, right? How about getting some practice in?" Tenzō's eyes widened and he hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah," he agreed. "Okay." Detective Marino seemed unfazed by Kakashi bringing someone along with him, and he shook Tenzō's hand with what appeared to be the same too-tight grip after being introduced. "What have we got?" he said tersely. There was an awkward pause then, as Kakashi kept silent. Ibiki looked at him. Tenzō looked at him. He looked back at Tenzō, raising his eyebrows meaningfully. "Oh, Tenzō fumbled momentarily as he realized that Kakashi expected him to respond, but recomposed himself quickly. "Nothing yet," he told the detective. "Our crew is sifting through the debris. We're looking for embers, but we'll also look for ignition sources. It's still early." Kakashi nodded approvingly. It was a good and accurate briefing. "Have you made any progress on the investigation?" Kakashi asked. He was curious, though he knew there was a high likelihood his question would be met with the standard "we can't discuss an ongoing investigation" message that all cops kept on standby. "Some," the detective answered noncommittally. "The perp knows what they're doing." That was code for a lack of evidence, Kakashi was sure. With this many houses around, someone might have a video doorbell that would have caught something, Tenzō posited, having apparently interpreted the detective's statement the same way Kakashi had. "There's a speed cam, too," Kakashi told him, pointing high up on a nearby utility pole. "Not sure how good the quality will be, though. It was installed a couple decades ago." Detective Marino nodded just once, dismissively. That was fair. He probably didn't need Kakashi and Tenzō to do his job for him. "We'll see," he said. "Perp's been a ghost so far. Very meticulous. Top brass thinks we've got a self-made hero on our hands." The words hung in the air between the three of them. They sounded innocent enough, but Kakashi recognized them for what they were. An allegation. They had entered a gray area between a briefing and an interrogation. The detective didn't seem too impatient for an answer. He fitted his gloved hands into the pockets of his coat and turned his head back to look at the crew. Kakashi followed his line of sight and saw Kotetsu and Izumo, not hard at work, but instead posing for photos with a group of civilians at the caution tape perimeter. "The fires have been across districts," Tenzō said, and when Kakashi looked at him, he had a frown etched deep into his features. "And they've all been set when the fewest number of people would be around. If someone wanted glory, this wouldn't be the way they went about it." Ibiki seemed to analyze Tenzō for a moment, eyes boring into the other man's brown, unwavering ones. "I think you're right," he said finally, the tension between them bursting like a bubble. "My guys will help you sift." He turned his head back over his shoulder and directed a few police officers to join their crew in searching. Kakashi took a step back. "Thanks," he said. "We'll let you know what we find." "Hey, Lieutenant," Kotetsu said, sitting down on the couch across from him, a soda can in hand. Izumo was standing next to him by the arm of the sofa, looking nervous. "We were just wondering. Hayate is in there with Captain Senju now, but when it's our turn, what should we say?" Kakashi raised an eyebrow, but didn't look up from his book or pause his gentle petting of Sparky's head as she laid it in his lap. These two were already on his nerves after how poorly they had represented the crew in front of the detective earlier that day, and now here they were with an absurd question like this. Tsunade had been waiting for them in the engine bay when they'd returned from the job, all of them sweaty and exhausted. She'd wasted no time in calling Anko into the captain's office and had kept her there for more than an hour before sending her out to fetch Hayate. "You could have told us she was coming," Anko had grumbled before heading off to take a shower. "Somehow, if I had, I think you might have suddenly caught whatever illness sent Asuma home," Kakashi had replied with a smile that had earned him a glare. Now, as Kotetsu had said, Hayate had been sequestered away with Tsunade for at least half an hour. Kakashi had no idea what she was talking about with the crew, but he wasn't worried. "Just be honest," he told them. Over the top of his book, he saw them both frown. "We'd feel better if you told us what to say," Izumo persisted. Kakashi sighed. They were clearly afraid of Tsunade. That was understandable. She hadn't been the most welcoming when the crew had first encountered her, and first impressions tended to stick. "Tell her Kakashi brought pornography into the station and left it out for everyone to see." Anko's voice rung out as she re-entered the room, looking refreshed, her reapplied cat-eye eyeliner restoring her mischievous look. Kotetsu and Izumo stifled a few laughs while Kakashi rolled his eyes exaggeratedly. "Don't say that," Tenzō warned, as though he was worried the two of them might take Anko's suggestion seriously. Kakashi was surprised to hear his voice from just behind him. Tenzō had been sitting at the island scrolling through his cell phone last time he'd checked. Now the man was standing behind the back of the couch, joining in on the conversation. Kakashi looked up to see him with his arms crossed over his chest. "Just think about it. What's been different since Jiraiya left?" Tenzō asked them. Kotetsu and Izumo seemed to think for a minute. "We do more training now," Izumo answered. "We get out to jobs faster now that everything is staged right," Kotetsu added. "Right. Our response time is better, and we survey the scene before acting so that we have the right tools and don't have to go back," Izumo agreed. They were on a roll from there, spouting out all of the adjustments the crew had made, all of the gaps they'd closed. They could have been Kakashi's personal spokespeople. Even Anko, now seated in a nearby armchair, had stopped pretending she wasn't listening to reveal a small, proud smile. Listening to these two probies rattling off a list of what they'd learned relit a flame that had been out for far too long in Kakashi's chest. He felt that feeling he'd so been lacking. That pride. That surety that he was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to be doing. It was tenuous, though, still flickering and threatening to go out. Tenzō's hand came down onto the back of the couch when Kotetsu and Izumo had run out of things to list, thumb making contact with Kakashi's shoulder. "Then tell her that," he said simply, and Kakashi was struck again by how capable Tenzō would be as a leader. "It's remarkable, Kakashi," Tsunade said, finally setting down the last folder they had to go through. "And you know I wouldn't just say that." It had taken more than 5 hours for Tsunade to grill the crew members one by one, and another 3 for her and Kakashi to go through the crew's records, budget, and outstanding items. It was late now, and Kakashi had surely missed whatever the crew had done for dinner. "Thank you," Kakashi said, placing the folder back in its appropriate drawer. "I knew you could handle the assignment," Tsunade continued, "but the difference you've made here? If you were a lieutenant, I'd be telling you to apply for the captain vacancy," she told him. Kakashi avoided dwelling on the comment. It was a moot point. He wasn't a lieutenant. And even if he was, he knew he couldn't take this assignment permanently. He thought of Tenzō, standing above him as he sat on the couch. He thought of what it might have been like if he had just raised a hand up to cup his jaw, what it might have felt like for Tenzō to lean into the touch and bend low, dropping a kiss on his lips. These imaginings of his might have just been fantasies that would disperse easily when he returned to Station 15, but it wouldn't do for them to persist much longer with him in charge of Station 10.
"Have they found anyone yet?"
he asked, breezing past Tsunade's words. She sighed. It could have been a response to his ignoring her comment, or in preparation for her reply. "No," she said. "A bunch of egomaniacs from other departments looking for a come-up mostly."
"How's Ibizu doing?"
Kakashi questioned. After all, once Ibizu was ready, he'd likely swap back to Station 15 whether a new captain had been hired yet or not. Tsunade smiled then, but it was a sadistic-looking one, her tired eyes shining a bit as she answered. "He's coming along," was all she said. Kakashi nodded absently, still caught up in wondering how much longer he'd be at Station 10, and what it would be like to return to Station 15, to his crew. "You all right, kid?" Tsunade asked, eyes softening. Kakashi pushed his chair back from the desk.
"It's been a long day,"
he told her honestly. Tsunade laughed, standing up from her seat as well and placing her hands on her low back for a stretch. "And they only get longer," she agreed. That morning's history was repeating itself as Kakashi's alone time at the kitchen island was interrupted by Tenzō yet again. The difference was that when it had happened the first time, no one else had been up yet. This time, everyone else had gone to bed already. There was no sunrise to be seen out of the kitchen window. Instead, the warm glow of the pendant light above was reflected back, surrounded by stark blackness. "Sorry," Tenzō said upon seeing him, sounding like he thought he might be interrupting something. "I just came in to get a drink of water." Kakashi looked at Tenzō. The warm lighting, his sleep-ruffled hair, and the simplicity of his department-issued t-shirt and shorts paired with a pair of navy socks made him look softer. The cues that normally signaled that they were at work were missing or obscured, and as Kakashi watched him pour himself a glass of water from the tap, he felt like maybe right now it would be okay to speak freely.
"I knew that place too," he said quietly. "That neighborhood, that playground."
Tenzō turned around to survey him for a brief moment before rounding the island and settling down on the stool next to his. "I thought so," Tenzō said, and then offered, "The speed camera," as an explanation. "I grew up there," Kakashi continued. "My dad was a single dad. He was in the service." Kakashi turned to look away from Tenzō. His gaze was open and welcoming, but too expressive. He addressed the microwave across from him instead. "I wanted to be just like him. A hero. He taught me that your crew was like your family, and that's what I always believed. And when I lost my crewmates, it was like losing family. But I saw that park today, and he was my only real family, and he was never home. And in the end, he sacrificed himself to save his crew and left me alone. We give our lives to this service, but the cost seems too high, Tenzō. Sometimes I don't know if I'm cut out for it. It's too hard to distinguish between heroes and fools." "I hear you," Tenzō responded softly when he was done, and he couldn't know how much Kakashi appreciated that he hadn't said, "I'm sorry." "But I see it differently," Tenzō continued. Kakashi allowed himself to look away from the microwave and face Tenzō again. He looked earnest, the pendant light's glow illuminating his thick, dark eyelashes. "Maybe it's because I grew up in the system without a real family," he said, and Kakashi felt his eyes widen a bit at the new information. But I don't see the crew as my family. My job as a firefighter isn't to protect my crew. It's to protect the community, the civilians who live here. They're my family, and I'll do what's right by them before I do anything else. Sometimes that means running into a burning building, and sometimes it doesn't. The perspective shift that Tenzō's word offered was powerful. It reframed so many key moments in Kakashi's life that he had to stop himself from spiraling into analyzing them all. This wasn't the time or place for that. Instead, though he might have been better served by thinking first, he dropped a hand lightly on top of Tenzō's on the quartz countertop for just a brief moment before lifting it up as he stood to leave.
"Thank you,"
he said as he exited the room. It's Emily OFC Podfic.